We all know about depression, and most of us either know somebody that's had it or have had it ourselves. Now, it can be debilitating, making it hard for you to do even the most basic of tasks. But from an outside perspective, it can look like nothing. It's been around for as long as we could trace back, and has even gone by a couple different names. That's why the evolution of depression is so interesting. While it might seem like second nature to call it depression, that even wasn't coined until the Victorian era. Now, the evolution of not only the term, but the way we treat people and the treatments that we give people with depression has changed gigantically. The amount of change that you see from the ancient world to the modern day is staggering. And to really cover that, we should really need to start with So for this section, we're mainly going to focus on ancient Greece. While everywhere was dealing with depression, the best kept records were in ancient Greece. So that's kind of why we're going to focus here. So, and the best way to understand how they viewed depression is to understand how they viewed illness in general. So, it generally was an imbalance of humors. There were four humors, as they put it: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. Now, each humor represented a different aspect and feeling. So, different diseases could be caused by you having too high amounts in your body or too low amounts in your body. And depression was caused by there being too much black bile specifically in your body. It was a thing called melancholia. And this wasn't the only view though, as more intense cases were viewed as madness. But not everyone viewed madness as necessarily a bad thing. Even Aristotle once wrote, "No great mind has ever existed without a touch of madness." While this was all happening, we did actually see a little bit of progress into what might cause depression, with Hippocrates writing that it may have had something to do with the brain, and he was spot on there. And since curing depression would be seen as rebalancing the humors, there were a couple ways that they did it. Most famously is bloodletting, something that we've all kind of heard of, but it's basically the process of draining out the bad blood, so you could rebalance the humors and your body would be rebalanced. Now, there were also some accounts of forcing people to purge, to kind of get rid of some of that black bile that's in their body. And those are kind of the ways that they mainly dealt with depression. Viewed them as having just some disease and, treatments not the same as today. But next we're on to finally, the Middle Ages, a time of knights and honor and kings and queens, right? Well, yes, but think more laxatives and bloodletting. The Middle Ages did change things up a little bit, though, from the previous generation, with Christianity playing a bigger role in society. Depression was sometimes seen as being caused by demons or demonic curses. This led to some treatment through circles of song and prayer, but this wasn't a very common view back then, as more people stuck with the humors as an explanation for why people were depressed. This isn't the end-all be-all, though, however, because there was some progression with some looking towards alcohol misuse and overworking for a reason of depression, which is a very modern take. They did, however, tests to see if individuals were of sound of mind before locking them up. This isn't as barbaric as you would imagine, more of a questionnaire than a burning alive or drowning or anything like that. But with that, on to the next, and that would be the Now, in the Renaissance, we do get a little actual progress, besides just the bloodletting. I am starting to think that's going to stick around for a while. We do get a new view on depression, where they began to search for natural causes and natural cures. They began to view individuals as having normal illness instead of just crazy. We will see that come back, though. They began to view individuals and start cataloging the symptoms that they had. One of the individuals at the time wrote down that their patients were sad, annoying, firm, severe, harsh, and envious. Though those might not all be symptoms of depression today, it's not too far off. Though the times of science were so greatly influenced by the humor theory, and treatments were along the lines of laxatives and bloodletting, they did actually start to try and change that. Now, we're on to the Finally, the Enlightenment. So this is where we see some of the most important developments so far in history. Now, first we gotta cover a little unsavory part of our past. In 1656, there was something known as the Great Confinement. The Great Confinement was where people that were seen as lesser by society were just thrown in jail. So this included people that were poor, people that were mentally ill especially. Now, it was anyone that was seen as crazy. While jailing of mentally ill patients isn't new, it was generally people that were seen as dangerous, and not just crazy by the public. This is also where we saw the introduction of the word depression. You know, the one that we use every day. Now, there is some hope though, because near the end of the Enlightenment, we actually saw for psychiatrists asking and begging for the mentally ill patients to be released from prison, as well as having some of the most important and earliest sightings of schizophrenia that we can track. Though bloodletting will not stop as a treatment, they did get a little more ingenious in the ways they deal with depression, some calling for the mentally ill to do physical labor, which is a very modern take. Though some treatments were along the lines of putting someone on a big wheel and spinning the depression out of them, so a mixed bag to be for sure. Now, on to the next. Now in the 19th century, we get the birth of modern psychiatry. We saw people locked up in 1656 with the Great Confinement, and that was definitely stopped by now. But we did see people being locked up in asylums. Now, these asylums were meant to help people, but they did have some major issues, including abuse and some other issues. But we did see a book published that tried to cover how these organic systems might affect our moods and everything like that. Now, while it wasn't accurate on depression, they still tried to figure it out. Mainly, it said that it was a temperament from the liver, since the liver was predisposed to sadness. Now, there is a massive difference from what we saw with some people just being predisposed to stuff, instead of just assuming that they were randomly getting crazy things from anything like demon possession or anything like that. And so this is also where they identified that some people who might commit suicide is actually because of the anxiety and the emptiness that they felt inside, than just assuming some other cause. Now, this is also where we get the degenerate theory, which sounds bad, but it's actually a very modern idea, that not only is people predisposed to depression, but it could also be from inheritance. So it's kind of a part of genetics finally playing a role in this new field. We also saw a little bit of medication being used here. While a significant amount were fake solutions, as many people tried to make a quick buck and sold fake brain pills or fake neck pills, we did see opium being prescribed. While today that might seem crazy due to it being so addictive, but it likely did help some people, especially people that were struggling on more intense things. And they also prescribed things like bath and massage. While might not be totally effective, definitely still helped patients that were maybe in turmoil at the time, and really helped them calm down. So with that, we're on to... So with the 20th century, we see everyone kind of put together all the pieces that everyone has been kind of theorizing on in the past. So this led to depression being defined in terms of symptoms. So a more objective way of kind of identifying people instead of the subjective way of kind of, I can define it when I see it. Now, they also viewed it as a psychotic conflict instead of a passive disease to heal. So they still locked people up in asylums, but we saw a much better treatment of them. We saw them really trying to get people outside and have a place where they can eat healthy, get outside, exercise, and all these things. It's mainly because they saw people who were blue-collar workers were immune to depression, which wasn't true, but it seemed like that at the time. So now, in terms of treatment, we get one of the most famous in shock therapy, where people were being held down to prevent hurting themselves, and they get a jolt to the brain that would kind of reset their brain. But with that, we also saw researches into cures of pathological causes. So instead of depression being caused by genetics or predisposition, it actually being caused by disease, which is something that we see in modern day with treatments with antibacterials and everything. This also, we saw in this century, the introduction of antidepressants. We saw some MAOIs and SARIs, which really focus on helping to rebalance the chemicals in the brain versus just a basic blanket that would cure everyone. And with that, we're on to And now we're on to the modern day. I personally wouldn't want to live through any of these other centuries because of all of the horrific conditions that people have been put into. Now, this century, we did see a massive jump on how we view people with depression. They're completely treated like normal people and not people that are crazy and undesirable to the rest of us. Now, in this century, we did also see psych wards being a significantly safer place for people to be that are going through intense episodes. They allow people to kind of recover without putting them in a dangerous spot where we saw abuse in some asylums and stuff like that, where not only were these people in danger of being harmed and everything, now people in these psych wards are safe and really, really put in a place where they can get better. Now, we also saw the introduction of SSRIs, which are a significantly less dangerous form of medication, where we see the side effects being more in terms of like weight gain, which isn't that dangerous, compared to overdosing and sedation, which can be really, really dangerous for people on medication. Interestingly, though, we do still use shock therapy. So one thing that people don't realize is that shock therapy is still used for people that don't respond to medication. Now, it is significantly safer, but it is really interesting to know that it still exists today. And it raises the ethical question of, is it okay to use shock therapy? Now, with that, we can talk about the real ethical question here, which is in the field of genetics. With us being able to identify genes that predispose people to conditions, and with people being able to buy these tests commercially and know what genes they have and what conditions they're predisposed to, do you want to know? Now, in the book The Gene, our author Sid talks about this exact ethical question significantly. He mainly focuses on the BRCA gene, in which the question is, would you want to know that you have the mutation for breast cancer? Now, the biggest thing is that it doesn't guarantee you'll get breast cancer. It only says that you are predisposed to it. So with that, is it worth knowing that you might get breast cancer? Because is the anxiety and the stress of maybe getting breast cancer worth the extra prep that you can do? It's a really interesting question, and it kind of ties into the depression genes. Now, there is no one gene that causes depression, like the BRCA gene, which does predispose you to breast cancer, but you can still get tested for chronic depression. And so with chronic depression, do you want to know that you might get chronic depression, that you might someday have an episode out of nowhere? It raises the question of basically, is ignorance bliss? Is not knowing better than knowing? Now, there are a plethora of different mutations that can lead to negative conditions, and a lot of people have to deal with this exact question. And a lot of people come to different conclusions. There is no right answer here, but it is interesting to think about. Would you want to know that you have the condition? I don't know. I personally would probably want to know, but a lot of people don't. Now, with being able to have breast cancer more often, you can get screened more often, and you can prep for the condition that you're predisposed to. But again, that anxiety, is it worth it? I don't know. That's a decision that you have to make for yourself. And you have to decide if you would want to know. Do you want to know what genes you have and what conditions you can get? But enough with that. Now, there are a lot of ethical questions that we've seen throughout history, especially with people being treated as undesirables, people with depression being seen as lesser. Now, this leads us to one thing that Sid also covers in this book, the gene. Now, he covers the idea of eugenics quite well. He talks about how people that were undesirable were basically seen as lesser, and basically not necessarily told not to have children, but were told not to have children. Now, these people with depression were seen as people who were undesirable and they didn't want them to have children. Now, this raises an important ethical question of, is it okay to do that? Is it better to make some master race? Of course not. I mean, the mutations that we all have make us ourselves. The changes that we have, the uniqueness of our genes, it makes us who we are. It's something that's really, really covered well in this book that I would recommend to all of you. It is an amazing way to understand and see the different ways that the genetics and everything can be applied to everyday life, and how the ethical questions of genes, of eugenics, of modern eugenics with genetic engineering. Would you want your children to never have depression? Would you engineer your children to never have the BRCA gene? I personally don't know. Is it better to put your children in a position where they don't know if they have the gene, or would you remove it from them? Would you make it so that they won't get chronic depression? I don't know. It's an interesting question, because where's the limit? Where would we stop? Now, we can make them not have depression, but would we make them stronger, bigger, faster? But that's a question for another time. That doesn't really get covered here in depression, but it is an interesting ethical question that we have to consider in the future of what we're looking at here. It's eugenics all over again. But with that, I appreciate everyone listening to mine, and I'll leave you with one thing. Thankfully, no more bloodletting. Thanks, guys.